My son's wife made me sleep in the garage during Christmas because I wasn't family enough for the guest room. She said, "It's just one night, Martha." I said, "And this mortgage is just one signature." They wanted me invisible for the holidays. I made their dream house disappear instead. They kicked me out of Christmas dinner. I kicked them out of their home. All right, before we dive into this incredible story, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Trust me, you're going to want to follow along for this one. I never thought my military training would prepare me for warfare with my own family. But here we are. 22 years I served this country. 2 tours in Afghanistan, 1 in Iraq, and more sleepless nights than I care to count. I came home with a purple heart, a limp that acts up when it rains, and the unshakable belief that respect is earned through service, not demanded through blood relation. My name is Martha Elizabeth Hayes, and I raised my son Daniel to understand the difference between entitlement and honor. Apparently, I failed somewhere along the way. The December air bit through my wool coat as I stood on the porch of what used to be my childhood home, now belonging to Daniel and his wife Cassandra. The house sat on 3 acres of Virginia farmland that had been in our family since 1952, when my grandfather bought it with his GI Bill benefits after Korea. The white farmhouse with its wraparound porch and red barn hadn't changed much over the decades, but the people living in it had transformed beyond recognition. I knocked twice, the sound echoing hollow against the painted wood, and waited. Through the frosted glass, I could see the warm glow of Christmas lights twinkling around a tree that reached nearly to the ceiling. The scent of cinnamon and pine drifted through the crack under the door, carrying with it memories of holidays when this house actually felt like home. Daniel opened the door wearing a sweater I'd never seen before, cable knit and expensive looking. His smile was practiced, the kind politicians use when they're trying to convince you they care about your vote. Behind him, Cassandra appeared in a red velvet dress that probably cost more than my monthly disability check. Her blonde hair was arranged in perfect waves and her makeup looked professionally applied. She clutched a glass of wine like it was a shield. "Mom," Daniel said, stepping aside to let me in. Right on time. The house smelled like money now. New furniture, fresh, paint, and that particular scent of people who've never had to check their bank balance before making a purchase. The living room had been completely redecorated since my last visit 6 months ago. Gone were the hand-me-down sofas and the coffee table Daniel's grandfather had built in his workshop. In their place sat cream-colored leather furniture that looked like it belonged in a magazine spread, not a family home where grandchildren might spill juice or leave sticky fingerprints. "Martha," Cassandra said, her voice carrying that particular tone women use when they're being polite but not particularly welcoming. "We're so glad you could make it." I set my overnight bag down by the door, the same canvas duffel I'd carried through 2 deployments. It looked out of place next to their coordinated Christmas decorations and crystal ornaments. Everything in the house looked like it had been purchased from the same high-end catalog, designed to impress rather than comfort. Even the Christmas tree seemed too perfect, its ornaments arranged with mathematical precision rather than the chaotic joy of family traditions. "Where should I put my things?" I asked, already knowing the answer wouldn't be what I hoped. Cassandra exchanged a look with Daniel, one of those married couple communications that happens without words. I'd seen it 1,000 times in my own marriage before my husband passed. The difference was, Robert and I used those looks to coordinate kindness, not calculate cruelty. "Well," Cassandra began, her fingers tightening around her wine glass, "we've been meaning to talk to you about that. The guest room is being used for storage right now, and Danny's old room has been converted into my office space. I waited for the alternative. In my military experience, you don't present a problem without offering a solution. But the silence stretched between us like a tripwire, dangerous and deliberate. "Mom," Daniel finally said, not meeting my eyes, We thought maybe you could stay in the converted garage. It's actually really nice now. Cassie had it insulated and heated. There's even a small bathroom. The garage. They wanted me to sleep in the garage like some unwanted pet they couldn't quite abandon but didn't want in the house either. I looked around at the spacious living room, the formal dining room visible through the archway, the staircase leading to what I knew were 3 bedrooms upstairs. This house had more space than a small hotel, and they were offering me the garage. It's just more private, Cassandra added, as if privacy had been my primary concern. You know how thin the walls are in these old houses. This way you won't be disturbed by any noise. What she meant was, this way you won't disturb us. I stood there in my service-worn coat, looking at my son and his wife in their Christmas finery, and felt something cold settle in my chest. It wasn't anger yet. It was recognition. The same feeling I'd had in Kandahar when I realized the local contractor we'd been working with had been feeding information to the enemy. The moment when you understand that someone you trusted has been playing a different game entirely. The garage will be fine, I said, my voice steady. I've slept in worse places. Relief washed over both their faces like they'd just avoided a scene. Daniel moved to take my bag, but I held on to it. I'd carry my own weight, just like I always had. The garage had indeed been converted, but calling it nice was generous. The concrete floor was covered with industrial carpet that smelled faintly of oil and rubber. A space heater hummed in the corner next to a twin bed that looked like it had been purchased from a discount furniture store. The bathroom was barely large enough to turn around in, with a toilet, sink, and shower stall crammed together like an afterthought. A small television sat on a card table, and a mini refrigerator hummed next to it. It was functional, nothing more. But what struck me most was how completely separated it was from the main house. To reach the kitchen, I'd have to go outside, walk around the building, and enter through the front door like a visitor. There was no connecting door, no way to quietly slip inside if I needed something in the middle of the night. They hadn't just given me a room apart from the family. They'd given me a different building entirely. I set my bag on the bed and looked around my temporary quarters. The walls were bare except for a calendar from a local insurance company and a mirror that had seen better days. No Christmas decorations, no family photos, nothing that suggested this space was meant for someone they loved. It was a place to warehouse an inconvenience, nothing more. The door to the main house opened, and Daniel appeared with a plate of food covered in aluminum foil. "Cassie thought you might be hungry," he said, not stepping inside. "Dinner's in about an hour, but she made you a little something to tide you over." I lifted the foil to find a peanut butter sandwich cut diagonally and an apple. The kind of meal you'd pack for a child's school lunch, not served to a woman who'd spent decades serving her country. The bread was the cheap kind that compressed when you held it, and the apple had a brown spot on one side. "Thanks," I said, setting the plate on the card table. "This is thoughtful." Daniel shifted uncomfortably in the doorway. "Mom, I know this isn't ideal, but it's just for one night. After Christmas, things will calm down and maybe we can figure out something better for next time." Next time. As if this arrangement was going to become a tradition. As if I was supposed to accept being relegated to the garage as my permanent place in this family hierarchy. I looked at my son, this man I'd raised to believe in honor and respect, and saw a stranger wearing his face. "One night?" I repeated. "I can handle one night." What I didn't say was that one night was all I needed. One night to remember exactly who I was dealing with. One night to recall that I hadn't survived 2 decades in the military by accepting unacceptable situations. One night to remind myself that I'd been strategic long before I'd been sentimental. As Daniel closed the door behind him, I pulled out my phone and opened my notes app. At the top, I typed, December 23rd, garage assignment. Below that, I began a list of observations, times, and conversations. Old habits from my intelligence days died hard, and something told me I was going to need a very clear record of exactly how this Christmas played out. Outside, I could hear laughter from the main house, the sound of a family enjoying each other's company. Inside my converted garage, I sat on the discount bed and ate my peanut butter sandwich, tasting something bitter that had nothing to do with the cheap bread. It was the flavor of disrespect, served cold on a paper plate. I'd been dismissed before, by commanding officers who thought a woman couldn't handle combat zones, by bureaucrats who assumed my injury made me less capable, by strangers who saw my graying hair and assumed I was past my prime. But I'd never been dismissed by my own son, in my own family's house, during the season that was supposed to be about love and inclusion. They'd made their choice. Now I had to make mine. The space heater clicked on, filling the silence with its mechanical hum. I pulled my phone out again and scrolled through my contacts until I found the number I was looking for. Marcus Webb, my financial advisor, the man who'd helped me manage my military pension and disability benefits for the past 8 years. More importantly, the man who'd helped me make some very strategic investments over the past decade. I didn't call him yet. It was too early for that. But I stared at his name on my screen and remembered a conversation we'd had 3 years ago, when Daniel and Cassandra had been house hunting. They'd found their dream home, this very farmhouse where I now sat exiled to the garage, but they'd needed help with the down payment and closing costs. I'd been so proud of my son, so eager to help him start his married life in the home where I'd grown up. The house they were living in, the one they'd just banished me from, had my name on more than just the family history. It had my name on the mortgage documents, the insurance policies, and several other pieces of paper they'd apparently forgotten about in their rush to redecorate and redesign their lives. I'd co-signed for this house. I'd provided the down payment, and according to the terms of our agreement, I'd retained certain rights that sleeping in the garage had just activated. My phone buzzed with a text from Daniel. "Thanks for being understanding, Mom. Love you." I stared at the message for a long time before responding. "Love you too, son. Sleep well." What I didn't add was, "while you still can." The space heater cycled off at 3:17 a.m., plunging the garage into a silence so complete I could hear my own heartbeat. I'd been staring at the ceiling for hours, watching shadows shift across the industrial tiles as cars passed on the distant highway. Sleep had abandoned me somewhere between the peanut butter sandwich and the realization that my son had just treated me like a burden to be managed rather than a mother to be honored. I reached for my phone, the blue light harsh in the darkness, and opened my photo gallery. The pictures told a story I'd almost forgotten in the sting of tonight's humiliation. There was Daniel at 8 years old, gap-toothed and grinning, holding up his first-place ribbon from the school science fair. The volcano project we'd worked on together for 3 weeks, staying up past his bedtime to get the chemical mixture just right. Behind him in the photo, you could see the corner of this very garage, back when it had been filled with lawn mowers and Christmas decorations, not converted into exile quarters for unwanted family members. I scrolled further back, Daniel in his high school graduation cap and gown, standing between Robert and me on the front porch of this house. The pride in his eyes wasn't manufactured or performed. It was real, the kind of genuine joy that comes from knowing you're surrounded by people who believe in you unconditionally. Robert's arm was around my waist, and my hand rested on Daniel's shoulder. We looked like what we were supposed to be, a family. Another photo, this one from Daniel's college graduation. He'd majored in business administration, following a path that seemed safe and practical after watching his parents navigate the uncertainties of military life. I'd flown back from my second deployment in Afghanistan for the ceremony, still wearing my dress uniform because I'd come straight from the base. Daniel had insisted on taking a photo with me in uniform, said he wanted everyone to know his mother was a hero. The word felt hollow now, echoing in the converted garage like a joke someone had forgotten to finish. The photos continued through the years, marking milestones and memories. Daniel's first apartment, a cramped studio where he'd served me dinner. on paper plates and apologized for not having real furniture yet. His first promotion at the accounting firm, celebrated with cheap champagne and expensive dreams. His engagement to Cassandra, announced over Sunday dinner in this very house, when I'd cooked pot roast and she'd pushed the vegetables around her plate while explaining her dietary restrictions. I paused on that photo. Cassandra's smile was perfect, practiced, the same expression she'd worn tonight when she'd directed me to the garage. Even then, 3 years ago, something had felt off about the way she looked at this house, at me, at the life Daniel had grown up living. She'd asked detailed questions about the property value, the acreage, the potential for development. I'd thought she was just interested in her future husband's background. Now I wondered if she'd been conducting a real estate assessment. T6. Engagement dinner had been the beginning of changes I'd been too hopeful to recognize as warnings. Suddenly, Daniel was too busy for our weekly phone calls. Family traditions became inconvenient scheduling conflicts. The casual visits I'd always enjoyed turned into formal invitations with specific start and end times. Cassandra had opinions about everything, from the way I cooked Sunday dinner to the furniture arrangements in rooms I'd organized decades before she was born. But the biggest change had been in Daniel himself. My son, who'd once called me every week just to check in, began communicating primarily through text messages. The man who'd never missed sending me a card on Veterans Day suddenly forgot. The boy who'd insisted on introducing me to his friends as my mom the soldier started referring to me as Martha in conversations, as if our relationship was professional rather than personal. I'd attributed the distance to newlywed adjustment, the natural process of a grown child establishing independence. I'd told myself that stepping back was healthy, that giving them space was generous. I'd convinced myself that love meant not making demands, not insisting on attention, not requiring the same level of connection we'd always shared. What I hadn't realized was that I'd been gradually erased from my own son's life, one dismissed phone call and declined invitation at a time. Tonight wasn't the beginning of their disrespect. It was simply the most obvious display of an attitude that had been building for months. I scrolled to the most recent photos, taken just 6 months ago during my last visit to the house. Daniel and Cassandra had been excited to show me their renovations, the way they'd modernized the kitchen and updated the bathrooms. They'd replaced my mother's china cabinet with a sleek bar unit. They'd painted over the pencil marks on the door frame where I'd measured Daniel's height every birthday, until he turned 18. They'd removed the family photos from the mantelpiece and replaced them with abstract art that matched their new color scheme. At the time, I'd complimented their taste, their eye for design, their ability to make the house their own. I'd swallowed my disappointment at seeing decades of family history painted over and replaced. I'd smiled when Cassandra explained how much better the house looked without all the old-fashioned clutter that had accumulated over the years. Old-fashioned clutter. That's what she'd called the photo albums, the handmade quilts, the collections of books and memories that represented 3 generations of family life. And apparently, that's what she'd decided to call me too. My phone showed 4:23 a.m. In a few hours, Daniel and Cassandra would wake up in their comfortable bed in their climate-controlled bedroom and begin Christmas morning in the house my family had owned for 70 years. They'd drink coffee from expensive machines and eat breakfast at a table that cost more than most people's monthly salary. They'd open presents under a tree decorated with ornaments that had no family history, no stories, no connection to anything beyond their aesthetic preferences. And I'd wake up in a garage, like some distant relative they'd felt obligated to invite, but couldn't quite bring themselves to welcome. I pulled up my text messages and reread Daniel's last message. "Thanks for being understanding, Mom. Love you." Understanding. The word sat in my chest like a stone. I understood plenty. I understood that they'd calculated exactly how little they could offer me while still maintaining plausible deniability about their intentions. I understood that the garage assignment wasn't about space limitations or storage needs. It was about establishing hierarchy, about making sure I knew my place in their new family structure. I understood that I'd raised a son who was capable of looking his mother in the eye and telling her that sleeping in a garage was perfectly reasonable. I understood that I'd welcomed a daughter-in-law into our family who viewed my presence as an inconvenience to be managed rather than a relationship to be cherished. Most importantly, I understood that my years of gracious acceptance, of stepping back to give them space, of swallowing disappointment to avoid conflict, had been interpreted as weakness rather than love. But they'd misunderstood something crucial about me. They'd confused patience with passivity, kindness with resignation. They'd assumed that because I'd quietly accepted smaller slights, I'd continue to accept larger ones indefinitely. They'd forgotten that I'd spent 2 decades in environments where strategy mattered more than emotion, where planning trumped impulse, where the ability to think several moves ahead could mean the difference between success and failure. I opened my notes app and began typing, my thumbs moving steadily across the screen as I documented not just tonight's events, but the pattern of behavior that had led to this moment. The missed phone calls, the shortened visits, the casual disrespect disguised as modern independence. I recorded dates, times, conversations, the slow erosion of my place in Daniel's life that had culminated in a garage assignment on Christmas Eve. Military intelligence had taught me that information was power, but only if you organized it properly. Random facts were just noise. Connected data told stories, revealed patterns, exposed vulnerabilities. I'd spent years analyzing enemy behavior, looking for the weaknesses that could be exploited, the inconsistencies that revealed larger strategic errors. Tonight, I was analyzing my own family with the same methodical precision I'd once applied to foreign adversaries. And what I was discovering was that Daniel and Cassandra had made some very strategic errors of their own. They'd underestimated my memory. They'd forgotten about financial arrangements they'd been grateful for 3 years ago. They'd assumed that my quiet acceptance of their gradual disrespect meant I had no other options, no leverage, no ability to change the terms of our relationship. Most dangerously, they'd forgotten exactly who they were dealing with. I wasn't just some aging mother they could shuffle off to lesser accommodations. I was a veteran who'd navigated hostile territory, a woman who'd survived situations that would have broken people half my age, a strategist who'd learned to win, battles against opponents who'd initially held every advantage. They'd given me a night in the garage to think, to plan, to remember exactly what I was capable of when people pushed me too far. They'd provided me with the motivation I'd been lacking, the clarity I'd been avoiding, the justification I'd been reluctant to acknowledge. I closed the Notes app and opened my contacts, scrolling until I found Marcus Webb's number again. This time, I didn't just stare at it. I composed a text message. Marcus, I need to discuss my investment portfolio first thing Monday morning. Specifically, the real estate holdings. It's urgent. I didn't send it yet. It was still too early, and I wanted to be absolutely certain about my next moves before I initiated them. But the message sat in my draft folder like a loaded weapon, ready to deploy when the time was right. Outside, snow had begun to fall, dusting the windows of the garage with white. Christmas morning was arriving whether I was ready for it or not. In a few hours, Daniel and Cassandra would expect me to join them for breakfast, to sit at their table and pretend that everything was normal, that sleeping in the garage was just a minor inconvenience rather than a fundamental statement about my value in their lives. I'd play along for now. I'd smile and thank them for their hospitality. I'd admire their presence and compliment their coffee. I'd be the gracious, understanding mother they'd decided I should be. But understanding worked both ways. And by the time Christmas dinner was over, they were going to understand something too. That dismissing a veteran was a tactical error that came with consequences they hadn't bothered to calculate. The space heater clicked back on, filling the garage with its mechanical warmth. I closed my eyes and began to plan, the same way I'd planned missions in Afghanistan, The same way I'd planned my transition to civilian life. The same way I'd planned every major decision that had brought me to this moment. They wanted me to disappear quietly into the background of their perfect life. Instead, I was going to teach them the difference between tactical withdrawal and strategic surrender. The lesson was going to be expensive. The coffee maker in the main house began its morning ritual at 6:30 a.m., the sound carrying through the thin walls that separated their heated comfort from my converted exile. I'd been awake for 3 hours, lying on the discount mattress and listening to the symphony of a house that no longer considered me family. Footsteps creaked across the hardwood floors above where my childhood bedroom used to be, now converted into Cassandra's office space. The shower ran for 20 minutes, followed by the whir of a hairdryer that cost more than some people's monthly grocery budget. I dressed carefully, choosing my clothes like armor. Dark jeans, a burgundy sweater Robert had bought me for our last Christmas together, and the silver cross necklace my mother had given me when I deployed for the first time. Each piece had meaning, history, weight beyond mere fabric and metal. Today I would need every reminder of who I was and what I'd survived to get to this moment. The walk from the garage to the main house was exactly 47 steps across frost-covered gravel. I'd counted them twice during my sleepless night, once when I'd gone out to get fresh air, and once when I'd tested how long it would take me to reach shelter if the space heater failed completely. Old habits from combat zones die hard. You always know your exit routes, your distances, your options for tactical movement. I knocked on the front door of what had been my family home for 46 years. The irony wasn't lost on me that I needed permission to enter a house where I'd changed Daniel's diapers, nursed him through chickenpox, and taught him to tie his shoes. But this was their territory now, and I was learning to respect the boundaries they'd established, even when those boundaries felt like barbed wire wrapped around my heart. Cassandra answered, wearing a silk robe that probably cost more than my monthly disability check. Her hair was already styled in loose waves that looked effortless, but had clearly required professional-grade products and significant time investment. She held a steaming mug of coffee that smelled like expensive beans, not the generic brand I'd raised Daniel on during the lean years after his father died. "Martha," she said, her voice carrying that particular morning brightness that some people use to mask their true feelings. "Merry Christmas. Did you sleep well?" The question felt like a test. Did I sleep well in the uninsulated garage on a mattress that had probably been purchased at a discount store? Did I sleep well, knowing that my son's wife had deemed me unworthy of a real bedroom in a house with 3 empty upstairs rooms? Did I sleep well with the knowledge that this was how my family had chosen to honor my service, my sacrifice, my role in their lives? "Like a baby," I replied, matching her bright tone. "Exactly." The garage was very quiet, very private. Relief flickered across her features so quickly I almost missed it. She'd been worried that I might complain, might make things uncomfortable, might force them to acknowledge the cruelty of their arrangements. My gracious acceptance had given her permission to continue pretending that nothing was wrong. The kitchen had been completely renovated since my last visit. Gone were the yellow cabinets my mother had painted by hand in 1978, replaced with sleek white units that looked like they belonged in a home improvement magazine. The old wooden table where 3 generations of my family had eaten breakfast had been replaced with a glass-topped modern piece surrounded by chairs that looked more like art installations than functional furniture. Daniel stood at the island, scrolling through his phone while an elaborate coffee machine gurgled and hissed behind him. He wore Christmas-themed pajamas that looked expensive, the kind of loungewear that costs more than most people's work clothes. His hair was perfectly styled even though he'd presumably just woken up, and he held his phone like it contained information more important than his mother's presence. "Morning, Mom," he said without looking up from the screen. "Coffee's almost ready. Cassie got this amazing blend from some boutique roaster in Seattle. Fair trade, single origin, the whole thing." I nodded appreciatively, though I couldn't help remembering the mornings when Daniel was 8 years old and would help me make coffee using a simple drip machine and whatever brand was on sale at the commissary. He'd stand on a step stool, carefully measuring grounds while I explained the importance of getting the ratio just right. Those had been good mornings, simple mornings, when the most exotic thing in our kitchen was the occasional box of name-brand cereal. "That sounds wonderful," I said, taking the seat Cassandra indicated at the far end of the table, as far from the kitchen island as possible, while still technically being included in the conversation. The coffee was excellent, I had to admit, rich and complex, with notes of chocolate and caramel that spoke to careful cultivation and expert roasting. It was the kind of coffee I would have considered a luxury during my military years, when instant packets and mess hall brew were the standard. But as I sipped it, I couldn't help calculating its cost. This single bag of beans probably cost more than I used to spend on groceries for a week when Daniel was growing up. "So," Cassandra said, settling into her own chair with a plate of what looked like professionally prepared pastries. "We thought we'd do presents after breakfast, then maybe take a walk around the property before dinner preparations start." Presents. I'd brought gifts, of course, carefully chosen items that reflected my limited budget but considerable thought. For Daniel, a leather-bound journal embossed with his initials and a pen set that had belonged to his father. For Cassandra, a silk scarf I'd found at a consignment shop, vintage but beautiful, the kind of quality piece that would have cost hundreds new, but that I'd gotten for $30 because I'd learned to recognize value when I saw it. Their gifts to me sat under the tree in identical wrapping paper, the kind of coordinated presentation that spoke to careful planning and significant expense. But as I looked at the packages, I couldn't shake the feeling that they'd been purchased, more out of obligation than affection, chosen to fulfill a requirement rather than express genuine care. "That sounds lovely," I said, though I wondered what kind of walk they had in mind. Would I be included in their tour of the property I'd helped them buy? Or would this be another opportunity to remind me of my peripheral status in their lives? Daniel finally looked up from his phone, his expression brightening with what looked like genuine enthusiasm. "Actually, Mom, there's something we wanted to talk to you about. Something pretty exciting." Cassandra shot him a look that carried the weight of previous conversations, agreements made outside my presence. Whatever they wanted to discuss had been planned, rehearsed, coordinated between them before this moment. "We've been thinking about the future," Cassandra continued, taking over the conversation with the smooth efficiency of someone accustomed to managing difficult discussions. "About this house, about our plans, about what makes the most sense for everyone involved." The word everyone hung in the air like smoke from a fire you can't quite locate. In my experience, when people started talking about what made sense for everyone, they usually meant what made sense for them, with everyone else expected to adapt accordingly. "The thing is," Daniel said, his enthusiasm dimming slightly as he approached whatever point they'd decided he should make. "This house is really too big for just the two of us. And the maintenance costs, the utilities, the upkeep on all this acreage, it's more than we really need right now." I waited, sipping my expensive coffee and watching my son work his way toward a conclusion I was beginning to suspect I wouldn't enjoy hearing. "So we've been thinking maybe it's time to downsize," he continued. "Find something more manageable, more modern, more suited to our actual lifestyle." Cassandra nodded enthusiastically, as if this were the most reasonable idea anyone had ever proposed. "There are some beautiful new developments about 20 minutes from here. Smaller lots but much more efficient homes, better layouts, modern systems, lower maintenance requirements." "And," Daniel added, his voice carrying the tone of someone delivering what he believed to be good news, "we'd be able to take the equity from this place and really set ourselves up for the future. Maybe start thinking about kids, about college, funds, about retirement planning." They wanted to sell the house. My family's house, the home where I'd been born, where I'd raised my son, where my parents and grandparents had built lives and memories and traditions. They wanted to turn it into liquid assets to fund their modern lifestyle and theoretical future children. Of course, Cassandra continued, her voice carefully casual. We'd want to make sure you're taken care of in all this. We know you have an emotional attachment to this place. Emotional attachment. As if my connection to this house was some quaint sentiment they needed to manage rather than acknowledge. As if 3 generations of family history could be dismissed as nostalgic. Feelings that would fade once the practical benefits of their plan became clear. We were thinking, Daniel said, leaning forward with what he probably thought was an engaging expression, that your portion of the proceeds could help you find a really nice place of your own. Maybe one of those senior living communities with activities and meal plans and medical support right on site. Senior living communities. They were suggesting that I take my share of the family house and use it to buy myself into an assisted living facility. They were proposing to sell my childhood home out from under me and use the money to warehouse me somewhere I'd be surrounded by people they considered more age-appropriate than my own family. There are some really nice places around here, Cassandra added, pulling out her phone to show me something she'd apparently researched in advance. This one has a golf course and a community center. They do movie nights and craft classes. There's even a shuttle service for shopping and medical appointments. She scrolled through photos of generic common areas filled with people who looked like they'd given up on having lives outside institutional activities. Smiling faces engaged in supervised crafts, organized meals, scheduled entertainment. The kind of place where independence went to die slowly under the supervision of well-meaning staff members. And the best part, Daniel said, his voice rising, with genuine excitement now, is that you wouldn't have to worry about any of the maintenance or upkeep. No more lawn mowing, no more snow removal, no more dealing with repair people or utility companies. Everything would be handled for you. Everything would be handled for me. Like I was an invalid who couldn't manage basic life responsibilities. Like my 2 decades of military service, my years of raising a child as a single mother, my successful navigation of complex financial and personal challenges somehow qualified me for nothing more demanding than supervised recreation and scheduled meal times. I looked around the kitchen that had been my mother's domain, then my own, now theirs. I thought about the garden behind the house where I'd taught Daniel to plant tomatoes and corn. I considered the barn where Robert had restored classic cars and where Daniel had learned to use tools and fix things with his hands. I contemplated the upstairs bedrooms where 3 generations of children had grown up, learned to read, dreamed about their futures. They wanted to sell all of it to fund their lifestyle upgrade and warehouse me in a place where I'd never again have to worry about the complexities of independent living. That's certainly something to think about, I said carefully, setting down my coffee cup with deliberate precision. When were you hoping to move forward with this plan? Well, Cassandra said, exchanging another one of those married couple looks with Daniel. We've already talked to a real estate agent. Just to get a sense of the market, you understand. She thinks we could list in the spring and probably have it sold by summer. They'd already talked to a real estate agent. They'd already made inquiries about market values and listing strategies. They'd already begun the process of selling my family home without consulting me, without asking my opinion, without even informing me that they were considering such a dramatic change. The market's really strong right now, Daniel added, his voice carrying the enthusiasm of someone who'd clearly had multiple conversations about this topic. Especially for properties with this much acreage. Developers are really interested in rural land this close to the city. Developers. They weren't just planning to sell the house to another family who might love it and preserve it. They were considering selling to developers who would tear down everything my family had built and replace it with subdivisions or shopping centers, or whatever would generate the highest profit margins. I nodded thoughtfully, as if I were genuinely considering the wisdom of their proposal. And you think senior living would be the best option for me? We think it would give you the most options, Cassandra said, her voice carrying the tone of someone who'd practiced this conversation. Financial security, social opportunities, healthcare support, recreational activities. Everything you'd need to really enjoy this stage of your life. This stage of my life. The stage where I was apparently too old to live independently, too burdensome to include in family decisions, too inconvenient to accommodate in their plans for the future. The stage where my value was measured entirely by my willingness to disappear gracefully into institutional care, while they liquidated everything I'd worked to preserve. I appreciate you thinking of my welfare, I said, my voice steady and measured. It's clear you've put a lot of thought into this. Relief washed over both their faces like sunrise after a long night. They'd been worried about my reaction, concerned that I might resist their plans or create difficulties they'd have to navigate. My calm acceptance was exactly what they'd hoped for. Permission to proceed with arrangements that would benefit them while requiring nothing more from me than grateful compliance. What they didn't understand was that I'd spent decades learning to control my immediate reactions, to process information completely before responding, to think strategically rather than emotionally. What they'd interpreted as acceptance was actually analysis, the same methodical evaluation process I'd used in combat zones when gathering intelligence about enemy positions and capabilities. They'd just given me crucial information about their intentions, their timeline, their assumptions about my options and limitations. They'd revealed their strategy completely, confident that I lacked either the resources or the resolve to interfere with their plans. They were about to learn how expensive that assumption would prove to be. The presents sat unopened under their designer Christmas tree like accusations waiting to be acknowledged. After their casual announcement about selling my family home and warehousing me in assisted living, the gift exchange felt like a performance we were all required to endure before moving on to more honest conversations. I watched Daniel arrange himself cross-legged on their expensive carpet, his Christmas pajamas incongruously cheerful against the weight of what they'd just proposed. Cassandra handed me a rectangular box wrapped in silver paper that matched their metallic ornaments. The coordination was perfect, like everything else in their redesigned life. Inside, I found a tablet computer, still in its retail packaging, with a card that read, "For staying connected, love, Daniel, and Cassandra." The subtext was clear enough. Since they were planning to relocate me to supervised living, they'd provided me with technology to maintain our relationship from a safe distance. "It has video calling," Daniel explained, his voice bright with the enthusiasm of someone who believed he was solving problems rather than creating them. "You can see us anytime, even if we're not able to visit as often as we'd like." Not able to visit as often as they'd like. The phrase suggested that our current level of contact was something they actively chose rather than something they'd gradually reduced to nearly nothing. It implied that video calls from an assisted living facility would somehow compensate for the loss of the family home where 3 generations had gathered for holidays, birthdays, and ordinary Tuesday dinners. "Thank you," I said, running my fingers along the sleek packaging. "This is very thoughtful." I handed Daniel his gift, watching his face as he unwrapped the leather journal and pen set that had belonged to his father. For a moment, something shifted in his expression, a flicker of recognition that spoke to memories older than his wife's influence. He opened the journal and saw Robert's initials embossed on the first page, a ghost signature from the man who'd taught him to throw a baseball and change attire and treat women with respect. "Dad's pen set," he said quietly, his voice catching slightly on the words. "He always said writing things down was important," I replied. "That thoughts had more weight when you committed them to paper." Daniel nodded, but he didn't meet my eyes. Instead, he closed the journal carefully and set it aside, as if handling too much history at once might overwhelm his carefully constructed present. Cassandra watched this exchange with the patience of someone waiting for an interruption to end so she could return to more important matters. When she opened her gift, the vintage silk scarf, she smiled with practiced grace and draped it across her shoulders for a moment before folding it neatly and setting it aside. "It's beautiful, Martha. Very classic." Classic. The word felt like code for outdated, irrelevant, not quite suited to her aesthetic preferences. I wondered if it would end up in a donation bag or the back of a closet, forgotten among the other gifts that didn't quite fit the life she was curating. "So," she said, clapping her hands together with the efficiency of someone moving a meeting along, "should we talk about the walk? The weather's perfect for showing you around the property." The property. Not our land or the farm or your family's home. Just property, a commodity to be evaluated and eventually liquidated. We bundled into coats and boots, and I followed them out the front door I'd once entered without permission, onto the porch where I'd taught Daniel to tie his shoes and read bedtime stories on summer evenings. The December air was sharp and clean, carrying the scent of snow and pine from the woods that bordered the back 40 acres. Cassandra had dressed for this walk like she was posing for a lifestyle magazine, her coat perfectly coordinated with her boots and gloves, her hair styled to look effortlessly windswept. She carried her phone like a tour guide's clipboard, ready to document or research whatever caught her attention. "We thought we'd start with the front acreage," she said, gesturing toward the fields that stretched between the house and the main road. "This is probably the area that would be most attractive to developers." Developers. The word hung in the cold air like smoke from a fire that hadn't been lit yet, but was already planned. I looked across the fields where my grandfather had grown, corn and soybeans, where my father had taught me to drive a tractor, where Daniel had learned to identify different types of birds during our nature walks when he was small. "The location is really ideal," Daniel added, his voice carrying the enthusiasm of someone who'd clearly had multiple conversations with real estate professionals. "Close enough to the city for commuters, but far enough out to feel rural. Perfect. For executive homes or maybe even a small subdivision." Executive homes. Subdivisions. They were describing my family's farm like a development opportunity, calculating its value in terms of how many houses could be built on land that had been preserved as open space for 70 years. The fields where I'd run as a child, where Daniel had played with our old dog Rex, where Robert had taught us both to identify constellations on clear nights, were being evaluated for their subdivision potential. Of course, we'd want to make sure any development was tasteful, Cassandra said, apparently noting something in my expression that suggested she should soften her approach. "Nothing too dense or commercial. Maybe something that honors the rural character of the area. Nothing too dense or commercial. As if there was a respectful way to erase 3 generations of family history and replace it with cookie-cutter houses, filled with strangers. As if tasteful subdivision names and preserved tree lines would somehow maintain the essential character of land that had been farmed by the same family since the 1950s. We walked toward the old barn. Its red paint faded, but its structure still solid after decades of weather and use. Robert had spent countless hours in that barn, restoring classic cars and teaching Daniel to use hand tools properly. The workbench was still there, covered with dust, but holding the same vise and tool organizers that had been there when Daniel was learning the difference between Phillips head and flathead screwdrivers. "This building would probably have to come down," Cassandra observed, making notes on her phone. "It's not really suitable for modern use, and it takes up space that could be better utilized. It's not really suitable for modern use." The barn where 4 generations of my family had stored equipment, housed animals, and taught children practical skills was apparently obsolete, a relic that needed to be demolished to make room for more efficient land utilization. The space where Daniel had learned to work with his hands, where he'd built his first birdhouse and repaired his first bicycle, was just wasted square footage in their calculations. "Dad loved this barn," Daniel said quietly, running his hand along the wooden doorframe where Robert had carved his initials 40 years ago. "He always said it was the heart of the property." For a moment, I thought I saw something shift in his expression, a recognition of what they were proposing to destroy. But Cassandra's voice cut through whatever sentiment might have been building. "Well, hearts can be transplanted," she said with a brightness that felt deliberately dismissive. "We can always incorporate some of the barn wood into new construction." Reclaimed materials are very popular right now. Reclaimed materials. She was suggesting that they could preserve the essence of the barn by using its lumber to build something entirely different, as if the meaning of a place could be distilled into decorative elements in someone else's home. As if the history and memory contained in those walls could be recycled into trendy design features. We continued walking, past the garden plot where my mother had grown vegetables for the family table, past the apple trees my father had planted as saplings, and tended until they produced fruit for 3 decades. Each landmark triggered memories that felt increasingly precious as I listened to Daniel and Cassandra discuss their development potential. The mature trees would be a real selling point, Daniel observed, looking up at the oak that had shaded our family picnics since before he was born. Developers pay premium prices for established landscaping. Premium prices for established landscaping. The tree where I'd hung Daniel's tire swing, where he'd carved his name when he was 12, where Robert had proposed to me on a spring evening, 30 years ago, was valuable primarily for its ability to increase property values for future residents who would never know its history. And the location of the house itself is really optimal, Cassandra added, turning to look back at the farmhouse that had been the center of my family's universe for 7 decades. High elevation, good views, perfect for a showcase home that would set the tone for the whole development. Showcase home. They weren't just planning to sell the house to another family. They were envisioning it as the centerpiece of a subdivision, the model that would attract buyers to executive homes built on what had once been farmland. The kitchen where 3 generations of women had cooked holiday meals, the living room, where we'd opened Christmas presents and celebrated birthdays, the bedrooms where children had grown up and dreamed about their futures, would become a marketing tool for a lifestyle completely disconnected from its origins. As we walked back toward the house, I found myself calculating distances, timing, sight lines with the same attention to detail I'd once applied to military reconnaissance. How long would it take to walk from the barn to the main road? Which parts of the property were visible from the highway? Where were the natural boundaries that might influence development plans? Old habits from intelligence work die hard. When you're gathering information about enemy intentions, you learn to observe everything, to note details that might seem irrelevant until they become crucial. I was applying those same skills to my own family's land, treating my son and daughter-in-law's development fantasies like intelligence reports that needed careful analysis. "So, what do you think, Mom?" Daniel asked as we climbed the porch steps back to the warmth of the house. "Pretty exciting possibilities, right?" Exciting possibilities. He genuinely seemed to believe that I would be thrilled by the prospect of watching my family home become the foundation for someone else's profit margins. He appeared to think that I would find it exciting to trade my connection to this land for a room in assisted living where my most challenging decision would be choosing between organized activities. "It's certainly ambitious," I said, stomping snow off my boots before following them inside. "You've clearly put a lot of thought into the potential." Again, they seemed relieved by my measured response. They'd been worried that I might become emotional, might resist their plans with inconvenient sentimentality. My calm analysis was exactly what they'd hoped for. Evidence that I would be reasonable about accepting their decisions regarding my future living arrangements. What they didn't understand was that my military training had taught me to separate immediate emotional reactions from strategic planning. Yes, I was devastated by their casual dismissal of everything my family had built and preserved. Yes, I was hurt by their assumption that I was ready to be warehoused in institutional care. Yes, I was angry about their presumption that they could make these decisions without consulting me. But emotions were intelligence to be processed, not impulses to be acted upon immediately. The pain I felt watching them plan the destruction of my family's legacy was information about their character, their priorities, their assumptions about my options and resources. The anger was fuel for the strategic thinking I would need to protect what they were so casually proposing to eliminate. As we settled back into the warmth of the house, Cassandra began preparing for Christmas dinner with the efficient enthusiasm of someone executing a well-planned event. She moved through the kitchen that had once been my domain, using appliances I'd never seen, and following recipes that bore no resemblance to the holiday traditions my family had maintained for decades. "Dinner should be ready around 4, she announced, tying an apron around her waist that looked more like a fashion accessory than functional kitchenware. "I hope you don't mind, but we're doing something a little different this year. More contemporary flavors, lighter preparations. I know traditional holiday food can be a bit heavy. She was dismissing not just my family's Christmas menu, but the entire concept of maintaining traditions that connected us to previous generations. The prime rib my grandfather had served, the stuffing recipe my mother had perfected, the pumpkin pie that had ended every family Christmas dinner since 1952, were apparently too heavy for their modern palates. I nodded graciously, as if this was just another reasonable adaptation to changing preferences rather than the systematic erasure of family traditions that had survived world wars, economic depressions, and personal tragedies. "I'm sure whatever you prepare will be delicious." As I said it, I was already planning my own preparations, the strategic responses that would honor my family's legacy in ways that Daniel and Cassandra would soon understand were far more substantial than holiday menus or gift exchanges. They'd shown me their plans for my future, their assumptions about my limitations, their calculations about what I would and wouldn't be able to resist. Now it was time to show them exactly how much they'd underestimated the woman they'd just assigned to sleep in the garage. The phone call came at 2:17 p.m. while Cassandra was preparing her contemporary Christmas dinner, and Daniel was sprawled on the couch, scrolling through social media with the glazed expression of someone avoiding meaningful conversation. I'd excused myself to the garage, claiming I needed to rest before dinner, when actually I needed privacy for the conversation that would change everything. Gloria Martinez had been my closest friend for 15 years, ever since we'd met in a support group for military spouses dealing with deployment stress. She'd stayed married while I'd become a widow, but we'd maintained the kind of friendship that survives different life paths, because it's built on shared understanding rather than identical circumstances. More importantly, Gloria had spent 30 years as a paralegal specializing in real estate law before retiring, and she had the kind of practical knowledge that turned good intentions into actionable strategies. "Merry Christmas, Martha," she said when she answered, her voice warm with genuine affection. "How's the family visit going?" I looked around the converted garage, with its industrial carpet and discount furniture, and felt the weight of everything that had happened in the past 18 hours. "It's been educational," I said carefully. "I'm learning a lot about where I stand in the family hierarchy." Gloria had known me long enough to hear the controlled anger beneath my measured words. "What happened?" I told her everything. The garage, assignment, the senior living suggestions, the casual discussion of selling the family farm to developers, the assumption that I would gracefully accept being warehoused while they liquidated my heritage for their financial benefit. As I spoke, I could hear Gloria making small sounds of increasing outrage, the kind of responses that come from someone who understands both family dynamics and legal implications. "Let me get this straight," she said when I finished. "They want you to sleep in a garage, sell your family's farm, and use your share of the proceeds to buy yourself into assisted living, all so they can upgrade their lifestyle with the remaining money." "That's a fairly accurate summary," I replied. "And they think you're going to agree to this because why, exactly?" "Because they've confused my patience with passivity," I said. "Because they've assumed that my willingness to step back and give them space means I have no other options. Because they've forgotten who they're dealing with." Gloria was quiet for a moment, and I could practically hear her legal mind working through the implications of what I'd told her. "Martha, tell me about the financial arrangements when they bought the house. You said you helped with the down payment?" This was the conversation I'd been hoping to have. The reason I'd called Gloria, instead of any of my other friends who would have offered sympathy, but not solutions. I provided 60% of the down payment, I said. $87,000 from my military pension savings. I also co-signed the mortgage because their credit history wasn't strong enough to qualify for the loan amount they needed. And what documentation do you have of these arrangements? Everything, I said, feeling the first spark of genuine satisfaction I'd experienced since arriving at the house. Loan papers, bank transfer records, co-signer agreements. I also have the original property deed showing the ownership percentages. Ownership percentages? Gloria's voice sharpened with professional interest. You're not just a co-signer, you're a co-owner? 40%, I confirmed. Daniel and Cassandra own 60% jointly. I own 40% individually. It was structured that way for tax reasons and to protect my investment in case their marriage didn't work out. The silence on Gloria's end stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the satisfaction of someone who'd just discovered a crucial piece of evidence. Martha, do you understand what this means? They can't sell that house without your written consent. They can't make any major changes to the property without your approval. They can't even refinance the mortgage without your signature. I felt something settle in my chest. A calm certainty that I recognized from military planning sessions when all the pieces of a complex operation finally clicked into place. I was hoping you'd say that. More than that, Gloria continued, her voice gaining momentum as she worked through the legal implications. If they've been making improvements to the property without consulting you, if they've been treating it as their exclusive residence while you maintain partial ownership, there could be grounds for demanding compensation for your involuntary exclusion from the benefits of ownership. Involuntary exclusion from the benefits of ownership, I repeated. I like the sound of that. There's more, Gloria said, and I could hear papers rustling in the background as she pulled out what sounded like reference materials. If they're planning to develop the property, if they're considering offers from developers, they have a fiduciary duty to inform you of those negotiations and include you in any decisions that would affect the property's value or character. Fiduciary. Duty. The phrase had a beautiful ring to it, like justice wrapped in legal terminology. And if they haven't been meeting those obligations, then they've been violating your rights as a co-owner, and there are remedies available under real estate law. Depending on how far they've gone with their development plans, you might have grounds for everything from demanding immediate consultation to forcing a partition sale to claiming damages for breach of fiduciary duty. A partition sale. The words hung in the air like a weapon I hadn't known I possessed. What exactly is a partition sale? It's a legal process that forces the sale of jointly owned property when the co-owners can't agree on its use or disposition. If one owner wants to sell and the other doesn't, or if one owner is being excluded from decision-making, the court can order the property to be sold and the proceeds divided according to ownership percentages. I thought about Daniel and Cassandra's excitement over the property's development potential, their casual assumption that they could make decisions about the farm's future without consulting me, and if I initiated a partition sale, what would that mean for their timeline? It would mean their timeline becomes irrelevant, Gloria said with obvious satisfaction. Once a partition sale is initiated, the court controls the process. They can't negotiate with developers, they can't make any major changes to the property, and they certainly can't pressure you into assisted living while claiming they need to sell your home to fund their lifestyle. The beauty of it was almost overwhelming. While Daniel and Cassandra had been planning my future around their convenience, they'd forgotten that I had legal rights that could completely derail their carefully constructed scenario. They'd been so focused on managing my expected emotional reactions that they'd ignored the practical reality of property law. Gloria, I said slowly, how quickly could something like this be initiated? With the right documentation and a clear case of co-owner exclusion, I know attorneys who could file papers within days of receiving your instructions. especially if there's evidence that the other owners have been making plans that would materially affect the property without your knowledge or consent. Evidence. I thought about the conversation I'd overheard that morning, Daniel and Cassandra's casual discussion of real estate agents and developer interest, their assumption that they could sell the farm and warehouse me in assisted living without significant resistance. I thought about the renovations they'd made without consulting me, the systematic erasure of family history in favor of their aesthetic preferences, the garage assignment that demonstrated their attitude toward my status in their lives. I have evidence, I said. Plenty of it. Then you have options, Gloria replied. The question is, what do you want to accomplish? Do you want to force them to include you in decision-making? Do you want to prevent the sale entirely? Do you want to maximize your financial benefit from the property? Or do you want to teach them a lesson about treating family members with respect? I looked around the garage where they'd housed me like an unwanted pet, listening to the sounds of Christmas dinner preparation in the house where 3 generations of my family had celebrated holidays together. I thought about their casual assumption that I would gracefully accept being discarded when I became inconvenient, their calculation that my love for Daniel would overcome any resistance to their plans. I want them to understand that actions have consequences, I said. I want them to learn that dismissing someone doesn't make them powerless. I want them to realize that they've been playing a game where they don't understand the rules. In that case, Gloria said, her voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who understood exactly what I meant. I think we should start with a formal notice of co-owner rights violation, something that establishes your legal position and puts them on notice that their plans require your consent. Something that makes it clear they've been operating under false assumptions about their authority over jointly owned property. And if they don't respond appropriately to that notice, then we escalate, Gloria said simply. Partition sale, breach of fiduciary duty, involuntary exclusion damages. Whatever it takes to protect your interests and ensure they understand. That co-ownership means co-control. I felt a smile building for the first time since I'd arrived at the house. How soon can you start drafting that notice? I can have something ready by tomorrow morning, Gloria replied. But Martha, are you sure about this? Once we start down this path, there's no going back to family dinners and Christmas presents. This will change your relationship with Daniel. Permanently. I thought about the relationship we currently had, where I slept in garages and ate peanut butter sandwiches while they made plans for my future without consulting me. I considered the respect they'd shown for my service, my sacrifice, my role in their lives. I reflected on their assumption that I would quietly accept whatever arrangements they found convenient. Gloria, I said, that relationship is already over. They ended it when they decided I was a problem to be managed rather than a mother to be honored. I'm just making the termination official. In that case, she said, let's make sure the termination is expensive for them. After we hung up, I sat in the converted garage and felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Genuine anticipation for the future. For too long, I'd been reacting to Daniel and Cassandra's decisions, accommodating their preferences, accepting their increasingly dismissive treatment because I'd confused love with accommodation. But love without respect is just exploitation, with better marketing, and I'd spent too many years being exploited by people who assumed my military discipline meant I would endure any treatment they chose to dish out. Tomorrow, they would learn the difference between strategic patience and passive acceptance. Tomorrow, they would discover that the woman they'd relegated to garage housing had retained some very powerful options they'd forgotten to consider. Tonight, I would eat their contemporary Christmas dinner and smile graciously at their modern interpretations of family tradition. I would thank them for their hospitality and compliment their renovations and maintain the pleasant facade that had allowed them to underestimate me so completely. But tomorrow, the education would begin. And by the time it was finished, they would understand exactly why dismissing a veteran is always a tactical error that comes with consequences nobody wants to pay. The space heater clicked on, filling the garage with mechanical warmth that felt like the purr of a weapon being loaded and prepared for use. The Christmas dinner unfolded like a performance piece designed to showcase everything that was wrong with their vision of family. Cassandra had prepared what she called elevated holiday cuisine, which apparently meant taking traditional dishes and removing everything that made them recognizable or comforting. The turkey had been replaced with something she called herb-crusted game hen portions. The stuffing had become artisanal grain medley with seasonal aromatics, and the mashed potatoes had been transformed into truffle-infused root vegetable puree. I sat at their glass-topped table, using silverware that cost more than most people's weekly grocery budget, and ate food that tasted like it had been designed by committee rather than prepared with love. Each bite was technically perfect, professionally, seasoned, aesthetically pleasing, and completely devoid of the warmth that had characterized every Christmas dinner in this house for the previous 70 years. "This is absolutely delicious, Cassandra," I said, cutting another piece of the game hen that bore no resemblance to the golden turkey my mother used to baste every hour while telling stories about Christmas dinners from her own childhood. "Very sophisticated." She beamed with the satisfaction of someone who'd successfully demonstrated her superiority over outdated family traditions. "I'm so glad you like it. I really wanted to bring something fresh to the holiday, you know? Sometimes old recipes just need a modern interpretation. Like family traditions were rough drafts that required her editorial oversight to achieve their full potential. Like 3 generations of women who'd found joy in preparing familiar foods for people they loved, had been working from incomplete instructions that only she possessed the sophistication to correct. Daniel raised his wine glass, filled with something that probably cost more than I'd spent on groceries in the past month. "To new traditions," he said, his voice carrying the enthusiasm of someone who believed he was participating in an improvement rather than witnessing an erasure. "To new traditions," Cassandra echoed, clinking her glass against his with the practiced grace of someone who'd rehearsed this moment in her mind. They looked at me expectantly, waiting for me to complete their toast, to endorse their casual dismissal of everything that had come before their arrival in this house. I lifted my glass, which contained sparkling cider because they'd forgotten that I don't drink alcohol due to interactions with my pain medication, another small detail that revealed how little attention they paid to my actual needs versus my theoretical requirements. "To understanding what's truly valuable," I said, meeting both their gazes steadily. The toast seemed to satisfy them, though I doubt they caught the multiple meanings embedded in my words. They were so focused on their own narrative of improvement and modernization that they missed the subtext entirely. This had become their pattern: hearing what they wanted to hear, seeing what they expected to see, interpreting everything through the lens of their own assumptions about my limitations and expectations. As we ate, they continued their enthusiastic discussion of development plans, apparently convinced that my morning acquiescence meant I was fully on board with their vision for the property's future. They talked about lot divisions and road access, about utility connections and environmental impact studies, about marketing strategies and target demographics. They discussed my family's farm like urban planners evaluating a blank canvas rather than children contemplating the destruction of their inheritance. "The really exciting part," Daniel said, serving himself more of the truffle-infused root vegetable puree, "is that we could probably get the first phase of development started within 18 months of closing. The real estate agent thinks there's already developer interest based just on the location and acreage. Already developer interest. They hadn't just been casually considering the possibility of selling the farm. They'd been actively marketing it, entertaining offers, moving forward with concrete plans while I'd been excluded from every conversation that would determine the future of property I partially owned. Of course, we'd want to make sure you're completely settled in your new place before any construction starts," Cassandra added, her voice carrying the tone of someone who'd thought through all the practical details. "We wouldn't want you to Have to deal with the noise and disruption of development while you're adjusting to your new living situation. My new living situation. She made assisted living sound like a lifestyle choice I'd made, rather than a warehouse solution they'd proposed, to eliminate me from their decision-making process. The assumption underlying her comment was that my relocation to supervised care was already decided, that the only remaining detail was timing the transition to minimize their inconvenience. That's very considerate, I said, taking another bite of food that tasted like an expensive restaurant's interpretation of comfort rather than comfort itself. You've clearly thought through all the logistics. We have, Daniel said with obvious pride. Cassie's been incredible about researching options and making sure everything works for everyone involved. Making sure everything works for everyone involved. The phrase would have been laughable if it hadn't been so revealing about their capacity for self-deception. They'd designed a plan that maximized their financial benefit while minimizing their ongoing obligations to me, and they'd convinced themselves that this represented thoughtful consideration of everyone's needs. What they'd actually done was create a solution that treated me like a problem to be solved rather than a family member to be included. They'd developed a strategy that prioritized their comfort, their financial goals, their vision for the future, while relegating me to the role of grateful recipient of whatever arrangements they found convenient. As dinner continued, I found myself observing them with the same analytical attention I'd once applied to intelligence gathering in hostile territory. Daniel had developed mannerisms I didn't recognize, ways of holding his fork and wiping his mouth that seemed learned rather than natural. His vocabulary had shifted toward the kind of business terminology that Cassandra used, full of phrases, like maximizing potential and optimizing outcomes that reduced human relationships to strategic calculations. Cassandra, meanwhile, had settled into the role of household manager with the efficiency of someone who'd identified a system that needed improvement and had applied her superior knowledge to upgrade its performance. She discussed the house renovations, the menu planning, the future development possibilities with the confidence of someone who'd assumed authority over decisions that had previously been made collaboratively or by people with longer standing, connections to the outcomes. Neither of them seemed to notice that I was contributing less to the conversation, that my responses had become more measured, that I was asking more questions than I was answering. They were so focused on their own excitement about their plans that they missed the signs that I was gathering information rather than sharing enthusiasm. The timing really couldn't be better, Cassandra continued, apparently determined to convince me of the wisdom of their proposals. The real estate market is strong, development interest is high, and there are some really excellent senior living options opening up in the area. It's like everything is aligning perfectly. Everything is aligning perfectly. From their perspective, I supposed it was. They'd inherited control of valuable property, they'd identified ways to maximize its financial potential, and they'd developed a plan to manage the inconvenient reality of my partial ownership by relocating me to a place where my daily needs would be someone else's responsibility. What they hadn't considered was that perfect alignment from their perspective might look like systematic betrayal from mine. They'd forgotten that I had options beyond grateful acceptance of whatever they chose to offer. They'd assumed that my years of stepping back to give them space meant I lacked the resources or resolve to resist when they stepped too far. It does seem like excellent timing, I agreed, setting down my fork with deliberate precision. In fact, I made some calls today to set things in motion on my end as well. Both of them looked up with expressions of pleased surprise, as if my proactive approach to their timeline was exactly what they'd hoped to hear, but hadn't dared to expect. "That's wonderful, Mom," Daniel said, his voice warming with what seemed like genuine affection for the first time since I'd arrived. "What kind of arrangements are you looking into?" I smiled, feeling the weight of the conversation I'd had with Gloria, the legal options we'd discussed, the documentation we'd reviewed. I've been consulting with some professional advisors about property rights and co-ownership obligations, making sure I understand all my options before making any major decisions. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees, though neither of them appeared to notice the change immediately. They were still processing my words, still trying to fit them into their existing narrative about my compliance with their plans. "Property rights?" Cassandra asked, her voice carefully neutral. "Is there something specific you're concerned about?" "Not concerned," I replied, taking a sip of my sparkling cider. "Just want to make sure I'm fully informed about the legal requirements when multiple parties own real estate jointly. It's more complicated than I initially realized." Daniel's expression shifted slightly, the first sign that he was beginning to understand that my conversations with professional advisors might not have focused exclusively on assisted living options. "What kind of complications?" "Well," I said, settling back in my chair with the satisfaction of someone who'd been waiting all day for this moment. "Apparently, when people co-own property, there are specific legal obligations about consulting each other before making major decisions. Things like renovations, refinancing, development discussions, sale negotiations, the kind of things that could affect the property's value or character." The silence that followed was dense enough to cut with the expensive silverware they'd used to serve their elevated holiday cuisine. I could see both of them working through the implications of what I'd said, trying to calculate how much trouble they might be in, based on their casual assumption that co-ownership was a technicality rather than a legal reality. "Of course," Cassandra said carefully. "We've just been exploring possibilities. Nothing formal, nothing that would require specific approvals." "That's good to hear," I replied, "because according to my advisors, even informal discussions with developers about jointly owned property can create legal obligations if one co-owner is excluded from the process. Something about fiduciary duty and good faith consultation requirements." Daniel set down his wine glass with slightly more force than necessary. "Mom, we're not trying to exclude you from anything. We've been including you in all our conversations. About the future." "You have," I agreed. "You've been very generous about informing me of decisions you've already made and asking for my acceptance of plans you've already developed. That's certainly a form of inclusion." The distinction between being informed and being consulted hung in the air like smoke from a fire that was just beginning to catch. They were starting to understand that their approach to my co-ownership might not have been as legally sound as they'd assumed. "Perhaps," I continued, "we should schedule a more formal discussion about the property's future, something where all the co-owners can review their rights and obligations before making any binding commitments." Cassandra's face had gone very pale, her sophisticated makeup unable to disguise the realization that their carefully constructed timeline might be about to encounter some very expensive complications. "What exactly are you suggesting, Mom?" Daniel asked, his voice tight with the first signs of panic. I smiled with the satisfaction of someone who'd spent the entire day being underestimated and was finally ready to correct that misunderstanding. "I'm suggesting that we all need to get much better informed about real estate law before anyone makes any irreversible decisions about anyone else's future." The coffee cups rattled against their saucers as Daniel set them down with barely controlled force. The expensive dinnerware that had replaced my mother's everyday china couldn't mask the tension that had settled over their modern dining room like fog rolling in before a storm. Cassandra's perfectly applied makeup had begun to show stress, fractures around her eyes, and her manicured fingers drummed against the glass tabletop with increasing frequency. "Maybe we should talk about this more specifically," Daniel said, his voice carrying the forced calm of someone trying to regain control of a conversation that had slipped away from him. "What exactly did these advisors tell you about co-ownership requirements?" I reached into my purse and pulled out a small leather portfolio, the same one I'd carried through military briefings when precise information delivery could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. Inside were printed copies of the relevant sections of Virginia real estate law that Gloria had helped me research, along with highlighted portions of our original co-ownership agreement. "Well," I began, opening the portfolio with deliberate care, "it turns out that when multiple parties hold title to real property, There are very specific legal obligations regarding major decisions that could affect the property's value, use, or character. I pulled out the first document, a printout from the Virginia Code that Gloria had marked with bright yellow highlighter. For instance, Section 55(1) to 2100 establishes that co-owners have equal rights to possess and use the entire property, regardless of their ownership percentages. That means my 40% ownership gives me the same right to occupy and utilize this house as your 60% joint ownership. Cassandra's face went very still. What does that mean exactly? It means that assigning me to sleep in the garage while treating the main house as your exclusive domain constitutes what the law calls ouster, I replied, reading directly from the highlighted text. The involuntary exclusion of a co-owner from the beneficial use of jointly owned property. Daniel leaned forward, his Christmas pajamas suddenly looking less festive and more like the costume of someone who'd been caught playing a role he didn't understand. Mom, we didn't exclude you. We offered you accommodation. In a converted garage, I said mildly, while 3 bedrooms in the main house remained available for use by co-owners. I pulled out another document. According to case law, ouster can be established by demonstrating that one co-owner has been relegated to substantially inferior accommodations, while other co-owners enjoy superior facilities within the same property. The silence stretched between us like a chasm opening in the ground. I could see them processing the implications, realizing that their casual dismissal of my comfort and status had created legal vulnerabilities they'd never considered. But surely, Cassandra said, her voice climbing slightly in pitch, these are just technical definitions. Family situations are different from business relationships. I turned to the next page in my portfolio. Actually, family relationships can create even stricter fiduciary obligations between co-owners. The courts have consistently held that when family members hold joint property interests, they owe each other the highest standards of good faith and fair dealing. I read from another highlighted section. Co-owners who are related by blood or marriage must provide advance notice and obtain consent for any actions that could materially affect the property's value, marketability, or character. This includes discussions with potential purchasers, developers, or other parties interested in acquiring or modifying the property. Daniel's face had gone pale beneath his holiday tan. We haven't signed any contracts. We've just been exploring options. Exploring options with real estate agents and developers, I clarified, pulling out the final document from my portfolio, which according to Virginia Code Section 55.12105 constitutes the initiation of sale proceedings that require written consent from all co-owners before they can proceed. I set the page on the table between us, pointing to the relevant passage. Any co-owner who engages in sale discussions, requests property valuations, or solicits offers from potential purchasers without the written consent of all other co-owners can be held liable for breach of fiduciary duty, regardless of whether actual contracts are executed. The words hung in the air like charges in an indictment. They'd been so focused on managing my expected emotional reactions that they'd completely ignored the legal framework governing their actions. Their assumption that family relationships exempted them from property law requirements had created exposure they were just beginning to understand. What does that mean in practical terms? Cassandra asked, her voice now barely above a whisper. I closed the portfolio and looked at both of them with the same expression I'd once used to deliver intelligence briefings to commanding officers who needed to understand the full implications of enemy capabilities. It means that every conversation you've had with real estate agents, every inquiry you've made about development potential, every discussion you've entertained about selling this property has been conducted without my consent as a co-owner. And? Daniel prompted, though his voice suggested he was afraid to hear the answer. And that creates several legal remedies available to me as the excluded co-owner, I replied. I can demand immediate cessation of all sale-related activities. I can require full disclosure of all communications with potential purchasers or developers. I can seek damages for any reduction in property value caused by your unauthorized actions. I paused, letting them absorb the implications before continuing. Or I can petition the court for a partition sale, which would force the immediate sale of the property under court supervision, with proceeds distributed according to ownership percentages. Partition sale. The words fell into the silence like stones into deep water, creating ripples that spread outward until they touched every aspect of their carefully constructed plans. A partition sale would mean we lose control of the timeline, Cassandra said, her voice flat with understanding. Completely, I confirmed. The court would appoint an administrator, set the sale terms, choose the real estate agent, and determine the minimum acceptable price. Your preferences about development, your timeline for my relocation, your plans for using the proceeds would become irrelevant. Daniel's hands were shaking slightly as he reached for his coffee cup. How long would something like that take? Typically 6 to 18 months, I replied. During which time, no major changes can be made to the property, no further discussions can be held with developers, and all current residents continue to have equal rights to occupy and use the entire property according to their ownership percentages. The implications settled over them like a blanket made of lead. Not only would they lose control of their development timeline, but they'd be legally required to treat me as an equal co-owner throughout the entire process. No more garage assignments, no more casual dismissals of my preferences, no more decisions made without my full participation and consent. Surely we can work something out, Daniel said, his voice carrying the pleading tone of someone who was beginning to understand how badly he'd miscalculated. We're family. We can find a solution that works for everyone. We are family, I agreed. Which is why your actions are so disappointing. You had months to include me in your planning process. You had dozens of opportunities to consult with me about property decisions. You had countless chances to treat me as the co-owner I legally am rather than the inconvenience you apparently wished I was. Cassandra's composure finally cracked completely. We were trying to take care of you. We thought assisted living would be easier, safer, more appropriate for someone your age. Someone my age, I repeated. You mean someone you've decided is too old to have opinions about her own property, too inconvenient to include in family decisions, too burdensome to accommodate in her own home. The accuracy of my assessment was written across both their faces. They'd convinced themselves that their dismissive treatment of me was actually consideration, that their exclusion of me from decisions was actually protection, that their relegation of me to garage housing was actually thoughtful accommodation. What do you want from us? Daniel asked, his voice hollow with the recognition that their power dynamic had shifted permanently. I stood up slowly, gathering my documents with the same methodical precision I'd once used to pack equipment after successful military operations. I want you to understand that co-ownership means co-control. I want you to recognize that family relationships require respect, not just obligation. I want you to acknowledge that dismissing someone doesn't make them powerless. I walked to the window that looked out over the fields where my grandfather had grown crops, where my father had taught me to identify different types of birds, where I'd taught Daniel to throw a baseball and ride a bicycle and believe in the pie. Importance of treating other people with dignity. Most importantly, I continued, I want you to learn that actions have consequences. That treating someone like an inconvenience to be managed creates legal vulnerabilities you can't afford. That assuming someone will quietly accept whatever treatment you choose to offer them is a strategic error that can become very expensive. I turned back to face them, these two people who'd shared Christmas dinner with me while casually planning to sell my inheritance and warehouse me in institutional care. Tomorrow morning, I'll be meeting with attorneys to discuss my options. By the end of the week, you'll receive formal legal notice regarding the violations of co-owner rights that have occurred and the remedies I'm prepared to pursue. Daniel's face had gone ashen. Mom, please, we can fix this. We can find a better solution. You had months to find a better solution, I replied. You chose to plan my future around your convenience instead. Now you get to live with the consequences of that choice. I walked toward the door, then paused and looked back at them sitting at their expensive table surrounded by the remnants of their contemporary Christmas dinner. Oh, and one more thing. According to Section 55.12103 of the Virginia Code, any co-owner has the right to demand an accounting of all expenses and improvements made to jointly owned property without the consent of other co-owners. Cassandra's face went pale. What does that mean? It means every renovation you've completed, every appliance you've purchased, every improvement you've made to this house without consulting me as a co-owner can be subject to reimbursement requirements, I explained. If the courts determine that your improvements were made without proper co-owner consent, you may be required to compensate me for 40% of their value, or remove them entirely. I let that sink in for a moment, watching them calculate the potential cost of every modern appliance, every design upgrade, every expensive renovation they'd completed while treating this as their exclusive property. Sleep well, I said, walking toward the door. I'll be in the garage, documenting everything for my attorneys. As I crossed the threshold, I heard Cassandra whisper to Daniel, "How much money are we talking about?" His response was barely audible. "More than we have." I smiled as I walked across the frost-covered gravel toward my garage accommodation. Tomorrow, they would discover that underestimating a veteran always comes with consequences nobody wants to pay. Tonight, for the first time since I'd arrived, I was looking forward to morning. The law office smelled like leather-bound books and successful litigation. Marcus Webb sat across from me at a mahogany conference table that had probably witnessed more family fortunes redistributed than most people could imagine. His silver hair and expensive suit projected the kind of authority that came from decades of turning legal technicalities into substantial financial outcomes for his clients. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, reviewing the documents I'd brought. "This is quite possibly the most clear-cut case of co-owner rights violation I've seen in 30 years of practice." Beside him, Gloria spread out additional paperwork she'd prepared overnight. Property records, bank statements, renovation receipts, email printouts from Daniel's correspondence with real estate agents. The evidence of their systematic exclusion of me from property decisions filled half the conference table. The ouster claim alone would be substantial, Marcus continued, relegating a 40% co-owner to garage accommodations while treating the main residence as exclusive property, establishes damages from day one of the violation. He pointed to a section of Virginia property law that I'd memorized by now. But combined with the unauthorized development discussions, the failure to obtain consent for improvements, and the breach of fiduciary duty regarding sale negotiations, we're looking at multiple causes of action that could result in significant monetary awards. How significant? I asked, though I'd begun to suspect the answer would exceed Daniel and Cassandra's worst fears. Conservative estimate? Marcus pulled out a calculator and began entering figures. 40% reimbursement for unauthorized improvements, approximately $67,000. Ouster damages for exclusive occupation of superior facilities, roughly $15,000. Breach of fiduciary duty regarding development discussions, potentially $30,000 to $40,000 in lost opportunity costs. He looked up from his calculations. We're approaching $150,000 in documented damages, plus attorney fees and court costs. And that's before we consider a partition sale, which would force immediate liquidation under court supervision. The numbers hung in the air like artillery shells waiting to detonate. Daniel and Cassandra had spent Christmas morning calculating the profits from selling my family farm. Now they were about to discover that their calculations had failed to buy. Account for the cost of ignoring property law. There's one more option we should discuss, Gloria added, pulling out a folder she'd prepared. Given the clear violations and substantial damages, we might be able to negotiate a buyout settlement. That resolves everything without court intervention. What kind of buyout? I asked. They purchase your 40% ownership at current market value, plus damages for the violations, plus a premium for your inconvenience, Marcus explained. Based on recent property assessments, your 40% share would be worth approximately $280,000. Add the violation damages and inconvenience premium, and we're approaching $400,000. $400,000. Enough to buy a beautiful home of my own, establish a comfortable retirement, and never again be dependent on family members who viewed me as an inconvenience to be managed. Enough to ensure that I'd never sleep in another garage or eat another peanut butter sandwich while being told it was generous accommodation. And if they can't afford a buyout? I asked. Then we proceed with partition sale, Marcus replied. The court forces the sale. I bid on the property on your behalf using your 40% proceeds as collateral, and you potentially end up owning the entire farm while they walk away with whatever's left after legal fees. The beautiful symmetry of it was almost overwhelming. They'd planned to sell my family home and warehouse me in assisted living. Instead, they might end up losing the house entirely while I retained ownership of the land my grandfather had farmed and my parents had preserved. My phone buzzed with a text message. Daniel. Mom, can we please talk? We want to work something out. I showed the message to Marcus and Gloria. They exchanged looks that spoke to years of experience with family members who suddenly became reasonable after discovering the cost of their unreasonable behavior. They're scared, Gloria observed. Good. Fear makes people realistic about their options. Marcus nodded. I recommend we send formal notice of the violations and potential remedies, then give them 72 hours to respond with a settlement proposal. If they're serious about working something out, they'll need to demonstrate it with more than text messages. And if they're not serious? I asked. Then we file for partition sale and damages recovery, he replied. Either way, Mrs. Hayes, your days of sleeping in garages are officially over. That afternoon, I returned to the house to find Daniel and Cassandra waiting in their living room like defendants before sentencing. Daniel had changed out of his Christmas pajamas into a business suit, as if formal attire might restore some authority to his position. Cassandra clutched a coffee mug like a lifeline, her perfect makeup unable to disguise the sleepless night she'd clearly experienced. Mom, Daniel began before I'd even sat down. We've been talking all morning about how to fix this situation. Fix this situation, I repeated. Is that what we're calling it now? Cassandra leaned forward, her voice carrying the desperation of someone who'd spent the night calculating numbers that didn't add up in their favor. We realize we made mistakes. We should have consulted you more thoroughly about our plans. You should have consulted me at all, I corrected. Co-owners don't make unilateral decisions about jointly owned property. Daniel ran his hands through his hair, destroying the careful styling he'd applied that morning. What do you want from us? What would it take to resolve this without lawyers and courts and all the legal complications? I looked around the living room they'd redecorated without my consent, filled with furniture they'd purchased using improvements to property I co-owned. In the house where my family had lived for 70 years before they'd decided it needed their superior aesthetic sense. I want you to understand what you did, I said. You didn't just exclude me from property decisions. You systematically erased me from my own family legacy. You treated me like an inconvenience to be managed rather than a mother to be respected. Tears were running down Cassandra's cheeks, smearing her expensive makeup. We never meant to hurt. You meant to control me, I replied. You meant to make decisions about my future without consulting me. You meant to profit from my property while relegating me to garage accommodations. I stood up, feeling the weight of everything that had brought us to this moment. But here's what you didn't understand. I spent 22 years in the military learning that respect isn't given, it's demanded. I learned that people will treat you exactly as badly as you allow them to. And I learned that sometimes you have to fight for your dignity, even when the people you're fighting are your own family. Daniel looked up at me with an expression I hadn't seen since he was a child, caught in a lie that had gotten too big to maintain. What happens now? Now you receive formal legal notice of your Violations and my intended remedies, I said. You have 72 hours to respond with a settlement offer that demonstrates you understand the seriousness of your actions. And if we can't afford whatever settlement your lawyers demand? Cassandra asked. I smiled with the satisfaction of someone who'd finally stopped accepting unacceptable treatment. Then you'll discover that partition sales don't care about your financial limitations. The court will sell this house to the highest bidder, and you'll receive whatever's left after my legal fees are paid. I walked toward the door, then turned, back for one final observation. You know what the irony is? If you'd just treated me with basic respect, included me in your planning, offered me a real bedroom instead of garage accommodations, I probably would have agreed to most of your proposals. I might have been willing to sell and help you achieve your development dreams. The truth of that statement hit them like a physical blow. Their greed and disrespect had cost them the very cooperation they could have achieved through simple human decency. But you chose to treat me like a problem to be solved rather than a family member to be honored, I continued. Now you get to live with the consequences of that choice. As I walked across the gravel toward my car, I heard Daniel call out behind me, Mom, please, we can fix this. I didn't turn around. Some lessons can only be learned the expensive way. 6. Months later, I was sitting on the porch of my new house, a beautiful Victorian I'd purchased with the settlement money from Daniel and Cassandra's buyout of my property interest. The farm had been sold to a conservation trust that would preserve it as open space in perpetuity, exactly what my grandfather would have wanted. Daniel sends occasional text messages now, usually around holidays or my birthday. Polite, distant, communications that maintain the fiction of family connection without the substance of genuine relationship. Cassandra never contacts me at all, which is probably the most honest approach to our current situation. But here's what I learned from sleeping in that garage on Christmas Eve. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give yourself is refusing to accept treatment that diminishes your worth. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for family members is teaching them that their actions have consequences. And sometimes, when people show you who they really are, the healthiest response is to believe them and adjust your expectations accordingly. I spent 2 decades serving my country and earning the right to be treated with respect. When my own family forgot that lesson, I reminded them in terms they couldn't ignore or dismiss. Now I sleep in my own bedroom, in my own house, surrounded by my own choices about how I want to live. And every morning when I wake up, I remember that dignity isn't something other people give you. It's something you demand for yourself, regardless of who doesn't want you to have it. That garage taught me more about my own strength than 22 years of military service ever did. Sometimes the most important battles are fought in your own family's driveway. If you've made it this far in my story, I want to hear yours. Have you ever been dismissed by family members who forgot your worth? Have you ever had to choose between keeping peace and demanding respect? Drop a comment below and tell me how you handled it. And if this story resonated with you, please hit that subscribe button and share it with someone who might need to hear that they're worth more than whatever treatment they're currently accepting. Sometimes we all need reminding that we have more power than we realize. Thanks for listening to my story. I hope it helps you write a better ending to yours.